Part 90. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 891. When Rong Yu returned to Dajhan Palace, he found Jean Ruo there too. In the past few months, Jean Ruo had spent most of his time in the priest's hall. Occasionally, he would only stay in the palace for half a day, and would say a few words to Yin Chuang before leaving. This couple was different from other people. They rarely showed affection, but they got along well. His appearance in Dajhan Palace at this time was obviously for the prince's business. Back, Nan 11 came out, with worry between her eyebrows. How is Hauer? Rong Yu understood that since Jean Ruo appeared, Nan 11 must know the cause and effect of the incident, and said truthfully, it was a close call. Nan 11 was relieved and silent for a moment. I don't know whether I should feel distressed or angry, but Jean Ruo said that Hauer's calamity has been resolved, so it is indeed a close call. The high priest will not live long, Jean Ruo said calmly. This time for the prince, the high priest has exhausted his vitality, but it's not entirely for the prince. It should be said that the high priest's deadline has come. Before a new high priest appears, the priest's hall will be useless, and the high priest's responsibilities have been completed. He will not appear again in the future. After these words came out, Rong Yu and Nan 11 were silent at the same time. Jean Ruo said, if another empress appears in Dongling 200 years later, perhaps there will be new servants of the gods. The selection of the high priest is different from the inheritance of the emperor. It needs to be someone who truly has spiritual roots, who has pure six senses, no desires, and who dedicates his life to the priest's hall and Dongling. We just need to fulfill our responsibilities. Who can control what will happen 200 years later, Nan 11 said, turning his head to look out the window. Destiny, heaven, gods, it seems mysterious, but in fact, they all have their reasons for existence. We should always have awe in our hearts and cannot despise God. People call the emperor the son of heaven, who governs the world under the command of heaven. Since he is the son of heaven, he should respect God and protect his people. If he is disrespectful, God will punish him, and the people will suffer. The wisdom and stupidity of the emperor directly determine the fate of the people in the world. Many people understand the truth. Whether it is the books of sages or the art of emperorship, they all teach emperors to be wise rulers, but how many emperors can really do it? If everyone on the throne can be wise, the change of dynasties will not exist. Each dynasty has its own destiny, and no country can always be blessed by God. The same is true for Dongling. In fact, I have always had a doubt. Nan 11 turned to look at Rong Yu. How long did the high priest live? Rong Yu shook his head slowly. Only he knows this question. See Her Majesty the Queen, see the regent. The guard of the East Palace entered the hall and knelt down to report. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince ordered me to report to His Majesty and the regent that he pardoned half of the punishment of Shadow Guard Fufeng and asked the regent to approve it. The hall was quiet. I know, Rong Yu said calmly. Tell the head teacher to follow the prince's wishes. Yes. Jean Ruo sighed. Your Highness, the prince is really courageous. This was probably the first time someone dared to pardon the punishment handed down by the regent, which was simply admirable. Nan 11 smiled faintly. Hauer was fair after all, and knew that the Shadow Guard was innocent. The Shadow Guard was indeed innocent. Jean Ruo nodded, but the second prince is not innocent. Your Majesty will give him a good beating when you come back. This kid really deserves a beating. Although the prince was destined to have a disaster, Rong Zhan's move could be regarded as indirectly helping the prince to overcome the disaster in advance, but one thing is one thing, Rong Zhan's behavior alone is still an unforgivable mistake. Rong Yu said indifferently, do you have anything else to do? Jean Ruo was stunned, then frowned, and said, I have nothing to do. Can't I stay here to accompany His Majesty? Do you want to destroy the bridge after crossing the river? Before Rong Yu spoke, Nan 11 had already laughed. Jean Ruo, you should go to accompany Yin Chuang and your son now. Jean Ruo was dissatisfied. His Majesty always favors him. Be good. Nan 11 reached out and touched his head, as if coaxing a child. You go and coax Yinchuang, she will also favor you in the future. Jean Rouault was speechless and had to get up and leave. It has been a long time since he had a good time with Yinchuang. It would be best if someone could take care of their children tonight so that he and Yinchuang can cultivate their relationship without distraction. Rong Yu put his arm around Nan 11's waist, and the two stood in front of the window and watched Jean Rouault leave. After a long while, Nan 11 sighed, this time, it's all thanks to the high priest and Jean Rouault. Rong Yu nodded, I'll go to the priest's hall tonight, you stay in the palace to accompany my daughter. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 892. When Rongzhan returned to the imperial city, his face was already full of exhaustion and haggard. The young man's high spirits could no longer be seen on his face. He had been driving for half a day and a whole night, and he didn't even have time to stop and take a breath. Xianyuan Zhan was still worried. The horse was so exhausted that he stopped him midway and replaced him with another horse. As for eating and drinking, Rongzhan had no time at all. When he arrived at the palace gate and dismounted, his eye sockets were already blue, and his lips were pale and dry to the point of peeling. The moment his feet landed on the ground, he even felt my legs were weak, my vision was dark, and my heart was filled with panic and uneasiness. He rested his head on the horse's belly to steady himself before he walked into the palace without looking back. Xianyuan Zhan and Xianyuan Hui followed behind and headed towards the prince's east palace. Seeing Rongzhan's devastated look, Xianyuan Zhan couldn't bear it anymore and said calmly, His Royal Highness, there should be nothing serious, so you don't need to worry too much. Rongzhan couldn't hear what he was saying at all, so he rushed to the East Palace as quickly as possible and was about to rush into the prince's bedroom, but was stopped by Rong Chen at the palace gate. Thank you for your hard work, Your Highness. Rong Chen lowered his eyebrows, His Royal Highness is resting, and no one is seen at the moment. Rongzhan was startled, and his heart gradually fell into the eye cellar. Brother Huang, don't you want to see me? No, Rong Chen said in a humble tone, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is weak. He woke up at noon and ate something. He just fell asleep. His Royal Highness came back after a long journey. You can go wash and change clothes first, tidy up your appearance, and then come see His Highness the Crown Prince. Rongzhan was in particularly bad shape at this time. Perhaps even he himself didn't know how ugly his face was at this time. There were dark green spots under his eye sockets, and his bright and energetic face was pale and haggard, with all its luster gone. His appearance was as messy as a refugee who had been homeless and starved for half a month. Not only does his face look ugly, but his physical condition is also not good now. He is in a panic. His legs are sore due to the non-stop driving, and the psychological pressure he has endured has almost brought him to the verge of collapse. Xianyuan Hui and Xianyuan Zhan soon arrived at the East Palace. Xianyuan Zhan was not surprised when he saw Rongzhan being blocked outside the door. I'm going to go see His Highness the Crown Prince first. You two look tired from all the work. Go wash up and change your clothes first. How can you behave in such a disgraceful manner in front of the Crown Prince? After saying this, he passed Rong Chen and walked in. Rongzhan's face turned even paler. Rong Chen told him that the emperor brother was resting and blocked him from the door, but Xianyuan Zhan could go in so openly, the emperor brother must be angry with him and didn't want to talk to him anymore. Come on. Well, Xianyuan Hui was not worried about whether he could see the prince now, but was concerned about the most important issue, how is the condition of His Highness? Is there anything serious? Rong Chen said firmly. Uncle Chu gave His Highness the Crown Prince 2 hours of acupuncture before he was out of danger, and repeatedly told him that during this period, His Highness the Crown Prince must not have any emotional ups and downs. He must have a good rest and not work too hard, so I still ask your Highness, please go back and take a rest first, so that His Highness the Crown Prince will not feel distressed and worried when he sees your haggard and pale appearance. Rong Zhan stood frozen for a long time as if he had lost his soul. I want to see Brother Huang. Rong Chen looked at him expressionlessly, his lips moved, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't bear it, so he turned around and entered the hall without saying a word. Not long after, he left and returned, saying calmly, "The prince is not awake yet." Rong Zhan was startled. So, the emperor really doesn't want to see him. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 893. A hand pulled his arm, and Rong Zhan turned to look at Xian Yuanhui blankly. Your current state is too bad, Xian Yuanhui said. Go wash up and change clothes first, and then come here to apologize to His Highness sincerely. The Crown Prince loves you and will not miss you. Rong Zhan was stunned for a while, not sure if he heard clearly what Xian Yuanhui said. After a long time, he looked at the prince's palace in a daze, turned around and left in confusion. It looked like an abandoned puppy. Fortunately, since the prince moved to the East Palace, several companions and the second prince also moved into the East Palace. Rong Zhan and Xian Yuanhui returned to their residences and took a hot shower as quickly as possible while being served by the palace people. Take a bath, change clothes, and take care of your hair and clothes. Although he was still haggard, at least he looked less embarrassed. Rong Zhan Xian Yuanhui reminded sternly, I think before going to see the prince, we should go and pay a visit to Her Majesty the Queen and the Prince Regent. Rong Zhan was silent for a moment and nodded slowly, yes. Indeed, you should go and pay your respects to your mother and father first. The two arrived in silence all the way to the Dajhan Palace. After asking Uncle Qingyang to report, Rong Zhan stood outside the Dajhan Palace with his head lowered uneasily, thinking about the disaster he had caused, not to mention whether he would still have military merit after going out to practice, which caused with such serious consequences. If he were not a prince, he would probably be killed with a stick. Qingyang quickly walked out of the palace, looked at the two of them with some sympathy, and said calmly, the regent ordered you two to kneel and wait. Rong Zhan's expression changed slightly, and his father also refused to see him. After a moment of silence, he whispered, Uncle Qingyang, this fault is mine alone. Please make another trip and tell my father that the matter has nothing to do with my uncle. He has been kept in the dark from the beginning to the end. I don't know anything. What nonsense are you talking about? Xian Yuanhui glared at him, who said I didn't know. Although I am not the mastermind, I am still an accomplice and should be punished. As soon as he finished speaking, he lifted up his clothes and knelt down, and pulled Rong Zhan's clothes, kneel down. Rong Zhan's eyes were slightly red, and his heart felt sour and uncomfortable, and he knelt down without saying a word. Qingyang sighed inwardly, feeling a little distressed and helpless. Who dares to intercede for his master's order? But the second prince indeed seemed to be regretting and blaming himself so much. Look at his frightened little face. I'm afraid no one is suffering more than him right now. Qingyang turned around and went back to the palace, feeling that he should have a good talk with Her Majesty the Queen. I'm sorry, Rong Zhan said in a low voice, I have caused trouble for you. Xian Yuanhui turned around and glanced at him, who made me your little uncle? It's okay to share the difficulties. As long as you behave better in the future and don't stop being young and old. Rong Zhan had nothing to say, he just felt his eyes getting hotter and hotter. A manly man, please don't shed tears. It's too embarrassing, Xian Yuanhui said. Besides, now is not the time to shed tears. Rong Zhan's voice was dull. What do you mean? Because we may be punished. Xian Yuanhui frowned slightly, and couldn't help but feel a little nervous. I heard that my eldest brother was disciplined by the regent and was very obedient. He didn't dare to breathe. And brother Xie, don't look at Xie. The eldest brother is usually majestic and fearless, but in fact he becomes intimidated when he is in front of the regent. After a pause, the most commonly used thing by the regent is Ratan. Xian Yuanhui originally said these words to let Rong Zhan relax, but Rong Zhan didn't react at all after hearing these words. His eyebrows were slightly lowered, and he knelt quietly like a sculpture. He didn't know what he was thinking in his heart. I think we are going to get attached to this thing, Xian Yuanhui reminded him. You might cry. Cry? Rong Zhan was startled and turned to look at him. Why are you crying? Being beaten will hurt. If the pain is severe, won't you cry? Rong Zhan pursed his lips. He didn't know whether to cry or not. He only knew that he really wanted to see the emperor at this moment. No matter how much others said, it would not be as reassuring as seeing him with his own eyes. He wanted to know what happened to the emperor. Brother and Ran, even if he is beaten to death, he will admit it. However, at the moment, he wants to see his imperial brother, but he can't see him, and his father doesn't see him either. He wants to admit his mistake, but no one cares about him. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 894. Your Highness. Xian Yuanzhan handed a cup of warm water to Xian Yuanhao. The second highness went to the Dajhan palace. Xian Yuanhao took a sip of water, put on his clothes and stood up and walked to the window. He stared out the window silently. Thinking of what his father said, he couldn't help but frown. Your Highness is worried about His Highness. Xian Yuanzhan walked up behind him and spoke warmly. His second highness should not have done this, but he also knew that he had made a mistake. Since I met him, I told him about your highness. From the beginning, he didn't stop for a moment. From yesterday afternoon to this morning, he rushed back without stopping. He didn't even drink any water on the way. His face was so pale, His Highness was right not to see him. I'm afraid he would feel distressed again when he did. Xian Yuanhao said calmly, the high priest said that there will be a disaster when I turn 16. Xian Yuanzhan was surprised. Disaster? Yes. Xian Yuanhao nodded. Originally, I thought that if I couldn't survive this time, I would let Rong Zhan be the crown prince. Anyway, the queen mother only has 2 sons, me and him. If something happens to me, Rong Zhan will not. It is no problem to train the 2 candidates well. He is kind-hearted and smart, and will be a good emperor for the people. Xian Yuanzhan frowned slightly. The high priest used to say that His Highness was the reincarnation of the Emperor's star. Since he is the Emperor's star, how could something happen so easily? Your Highness must not have these thoughts. Always make foolproof plans. Xian Yuanzhan pondered. Then His Highness has survived the disaster safely this time. Maybe. Xian Yuanhao sighed. So even if there is no Rong Zhan, I will have other hardships. In this way, His Highness is not only right, but has actually made a meritorious service. Xian Yuanhao slowly shook his head. Making meritorious service does not count. His temperament still needs to be changed. This opportunity is just for him to remember his lesson. He must not act recklessly in the future. Xian Yuanzhan nodded. That's right. No matter whether the prince resolved the disaster because of His Highness's actions, it cannot be said that his actions were right. Taking this opportunity to change his impulsive habit is not a bad thing. Only. Xian Yuanzhan frowned. I'm afraid it will be difficult for the regent. Isn't His Highness worried? Worry? Xian Yuanhao said, but it's useless to worry. Who can change the decision made by my father? Xian Yuanzhan was speechless for a moment. Yes, who can change the regent's decision? Go and rest. Xian Yuanhao turned his head and looked at the tired look on Xian Yuanzhan's brows and eyes. Thank you for your hard work. Xian Yuanzhan shook his head. Your Highness, there is no need to worry about me. I will be fine if I take a nap. It won't be a problem. Xian Yuanhao hummed and said nothing more. Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui knelt outside the Dajhan palace for an hour and no one paid attention to them. In the biting cold wind, the two tired and hungry young men were shivering with cold. Originally, people who practiced martial arts would not be so afraid of the cold, but the two of them came all the way at a high speed, without even drinking any hot water. My stomach was empty, and my body was extremely exhausted at this time. The cold wind kept blowing for an hour, and my face turned blue from the cold, my limbs were stiff, and it seemed like it was too much. Hauer just turned around a little. Don't let these two freeze out again. 11er stood at the door of the palace, glanced from a distance, then turned to look at Rong Yu. Let them rest. Rong Yu didn't say anything. He looked at the two people who were thin in the cold wind with an expressionless face, and said calmly, let them go back and rest, take a hot bath, and ask the small kitchen of the East Palace to prepare some ginger soup for them to ward off the cold. Have a good sleep tonight and go to the martial arts field early tomorrow morning. Qingyang agreed, turned around and walked out, repeating what the regent said word for word, and reminded him gently, the regent asked you to wait at the martial arts training ground tomorrow morning. It must be to test your martial arts and skills. Archery, you two young masters must have a good rest and recuperate your spirits when you go back tonight, otherwise you will have a hard time with this test tomorrow. Xian Yuanhui nodded, thank you for reminding me. Rongzhan didn't react at all. In fact, he was not completely unresponsive. He was just thinking that maybe he should go back to rest and have a good sleep. At the moment, he was already a little exhausted. No matter whether his father wanted to punish him or train him in the martial arts field, with his current strength his physical strength could no longer support him. In order to avoid angering his father again, he had to take a good rest. It's just that his whole body hurts now, especially his knees and legs. The pain is so painful that it doesn't even feel like his own. He tried to move his body, but it was so stiff that it was difficult to even stand up. Qingyang noticed something strange and quickly stretched out his hand to help Rongzhan up, feeling really sorry for the second highness. Rongzhan was hopeless when he saw his father, and he was worried about his brother. Tormented by both, he seemed to have lost all his strength. After thanking Qingyang, he turned around and left the Dajhan palace in loneliness. Xian Yuanhui is actually not much better off than him. The only difference is that the burden on his heart is not as heavy as Rongzhan's, and the rest is similar to Rongzhan's. Qingyang called a few guards to send them back. It wasn't until the two young men disappeared from sight that he turned around and returned to the Dajhan palace. After returning to their residence, the palace servants served them carefully, fetching hot water and washing up. The ginger soup had already been cooked and served. The palace servant said, His Royal Highness the Prince asked the kitchen to cook the ginger soup. Your Highness quickly drank it to drive away the cold. Rongzhan's expression moved slightly, and his eyelashes couldn't help but tremble. Brother, did you let someone cook it? Yes. When the second highness went to the Dajhan palace to pay his respects, His Highness the Crown Prince ordered someone to cook it. The palace servant respectfully advised, Your Highness, please drink quickly. After drinking the ginger soup, eat some hot food to cushion your stomach. The Crown Prince His Highness orders you to have a good sleep. Rongzhan was stunned for a moment, and couldn't help but have water vapor in his eyes again. He never thought that he was a fragile person who cried easily, but today he couldn't help it. He couldn't control his emotions again and again. Hot mists rose in his eyes and he couldn't suppress them. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 895. Although this day was long and difficult, it ended peacefully. Rongzhan didn't sleep well while lying on the bed. After drinking ginger soup, eating meals, and taking a hot bath, it was not completely dark outside. It was only evening. But his physical condition could not support him to do anything else, so he could only sleep. After dismissing all the palace servants, Rongzhan lay alone on the bed, staring at the curtains quietly, surrounded by boundless loneliness. He felt uncomfortable everywhere, his knees and thighs hurt, his eyes were sore, his head was dizzy and uncomfortable, but he couldn't sleep, and he couldn't help hating and regretting his stupid behavior. He thought a lot. He knew that his behavior was childish and hateful. His brother cared about him so much, but he almost killed his brother. Such a serious mistake could not be compensated by any punishment. Rongzhan had never hated himself so much before. Thinking about it, he couldn't help but wipe away tears. There was no one else here, so he was not afraid of being embarrassed. Tears flowed freely from his eyes as if they were free. Rongzhan reached out and pulled the quilt over him, crying silently, and indulging himself in vulnerability for once. The choking tears contained endless regret, fear, loneliness, and a little bit of unspeakable grievance. He knew that he should not be wronged, and he was not qualified to be wronged, but he could not help it. He would rather his father and brother beat him up than ignore him like this. Rongzhan cried alone for nearly half an hour. When the night fell, he finally fell asleep exhausted, and the quilt was soaked with tears. His eyelashes were still wet when he fell asleep. In the middle of the night, Rongyu walked into the bedroom while the palace servants on duty knelt on the ground and saluted silently. He stood by the bed and looked for a while. His eyes fell on Rongzhan's red and swollen eyes and the remaining tears on his face, and he was silent for a long time. Because Rongzhan had driven everyone out early, the lights in the hall had not been extinguished yet. Now they had burned out, leaving only the last flickering candle light. Rongyu gently waved his sleeves, and the lights went out. He then turned and left, silently as if he had never been there. A good night's sleep. Ever since Xian Yuanhao started to deal with government affairs, he had been accustomed to going to bed and getting up early, but his body had been injured in the past 2 days, so he couldn't help but sleep for half an hour longer in the morning. When he woke up, he heard Rong Chen report, the second prince and Master Hui went to the parade ground. Xian Yuanhao was silent for a moment, and he roughly guessed what was going on, and said calmly, "Is my father here too?" "Yes." Xian Yuanhao hummed, "I'll go and see." The regent ordered that the prince is not allowed to go there. Rong Chen lowered his eyes and said in a low voice, "The regent ordered your highness to stay in the bedroom to rest, and not to go anywhere. If you are really bored, you can play chess with Master Zhan." Xian Yuanhao was silent. The regent also said that if His Royal Highness the Crown Prince doesn't obey, His Royal Highness the second prince won't have to leave the training ground today. Xian Yuanhao lowered his eyes, completely speechless. "Your Highness should stay in the palace and have a good rest. It's cold outside, and your Highness is weak. I'm afraid you can't handle it." Xian Yuanzhan came in with medicine, and a strong smell of medicine instantly diffused in the air. "This is the soup my uncle just boiled. Let it cool here for a while. Your Highness should drink the medicine after washing up." Xian Yuanhao was silent for a moment, as an, "Go to the training ground to check the situation, and come back to tell me at noon." Xian Yuanzhan nodded, "Yes." Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui got up at dawn. They were originally guilty, so they naturally didn't dare to sleep too late. They got up, washed up, changed clothes, and had a simple breakfast. After that, the two of them arrived at the training ground in a light and fitting black shorts. Before the regent arrived, 6 targets had been fixed on the training ground. On both sides were rows of weapons, spears, swords, bows and arrows were the most numerous, so many that Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui were both speechless. The regent asked His Highness and Master Hui to warm up first. The guards on duty outside the parade ground were responsible for conveying the regent's order. "The regent will be here later." Rongzhan looked at the guards standing outside the parade ground and nodded slowly. Rongzhan, I have a bad feeling. Xian Yuanhui looked at the neatly arranged weapons on both sides and hundreds of eagle feather arrows. Will we give our lives here today? Rongzhan did not speak, retracted his gaze, and his eyes fell silently on these arrows. The arrows used by the royal nobles are naturally excellent. The arrows are 2 feet long, the arrow shaft is made of tough birch, the arrowhead is made of metal, and the tail is clamped with long feathers of birds, so it is called eagle feather arrows. This kind of arrow is more powerful than the arrows used by ordinary soldiers, and its lethality is much greater, but these are not the main points. The main point is that so many arrows are placed here, not for them to watch. Your Highness, the regent is here. The guards outside the parade ground reminded him respectfully. Rongzhan was startled and turned his head to see his father walking towards the parade ground, followed by the Qingyang guards and 2 other guards. There was no sedan chair or grand ceremony, and he was even wearing a casual clothes, but he couldn't hide the awe-inspiring aura and pressure around him. Rongzhan's expression was slightly tense, and he knelt down with his eyes down, his back straight. The regent's aura is really scary. Xian Yuanhui knelt beside Rongzhan, and murmured inaudibly, I feel that today is not a good day. Rongzhan didn't speak. At this time, he didn't have the courage or mood to speak. His heart was already hanging in his throat, especially as his father got closer and closer. His heart was beating more and more violently, and he could clearly hear the sound of his heart about to jump out of his chest. Rong Yu walked onto the training ground and looked over their heads. Have you had breakfast? Xian Yuanhui nodded. I ate. Rongzhan also nodded stiffly. How did you sleep last night? Very good. Xian Yuanhui answered with a stiff face. Thank you for your concern, Regent. I slept well too. Rongzhan lowered his head. Thank you for your concern, Father. In that case, let's get started. Rong Yu turned around and looked at the weapons array. Pick any bow and shoot at the target at 100 steps. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbspeed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300 x 250, placement, below article thumbnail -300 x 250, target. Type, mix. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 896. 100-step shooting target. Xian Yuanhui and Rongzhan breathed a sigh of relief almost at the same time. This is not difficult. Both of them are working hard in the direction of military generals. Naturally, they are not bad at martial arts and archery, especially archery. Both of them have worked hard and have no problem. Before going to Huainan, Rongzhan was detained by the emperor's brother on the school field and trained hard for half a year. However, it soon proved that the two were still too naive and too young. They each picked a bow, put 10 arrows in the quiver and carried them behind their backs. Rongzhan chose a suitable position to stand, took the arrows and stringed the bow, aiming at the target 100 steps away, pulling the bow tightly. Tight, let go. Whoosh. The arrow left the string and flew towards the target 100 steps away with fierce force, in the direction of the target's red heart. Rongzhan thought he could hit it. But what he thought was that when he saw his father randomly taking out an arrow and throwing it, and then easily intercepted the arrow he shot, he suddenly understood what he would face today. The arrow he shot collided with his father's arrow, and both arrows fell to the ground. Rongzhan's face turned pale in an instant. Before he could react, he saw the arrow shot by Xian Yuanhui with the same force. They were shot down in such a way that they lost all confidence before they could even touch the edge of the target. Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui stood frozen on the shooting range, at a loss. Continue. Rong Yu's voice was cold and hard, leaving no room for doubt. Rong Zhan and Xianyu and Hui shuddered at the same time, and then in unison, they took out arrows from the quiver behind them, stringed their bows, took aim, and shot. Whoosh! The two arrows were shot out with almost the same force. However, they only reached halfway and were quickly shot down by another arrow flying over. Once again, the target failed. This time, without being ordered by Rong Yu, the two of them continued to draw arrows and shoot at the target consciously. They drew and wound the bows in the same movement, shooting at the same speed and with the same force. The two arrows went side by side. The wind was fierce and the cold air was thick. If you don't look at Rong Yu and just look at the archery skills of these two people, they can be regarded as at least above average. Among peers, even if they dare not be ranked first or second, Rong Zhan's archery skills are rarely matched by others. However, today they met a person who was once called the evil god, which destined them to have no room to display their best archery skills. Click. The two arrows were broken by a strong force and fell to the ground. The two of them did not stop, and continued to draw arrows, draw the bow, and shoot out. They repeated the same actions one after another, and one after another arrows were shot to the ground midway. Until the quivers behind the two men were empty and all 10 arrows were shot, the target 100 steps away was still empty. The air seemed to become quiet. Rong Yu held an arrow in his hand, his eyes fell on Rong Zhan's face, and his voice was calm, "Come here." Rong Zhan's heart sank slightly and he walked over without saying a word. Xianyu and Hui secretly glanced at Rong Yu's expression, and then walked over and stood next to Rong Zhan. His pupils suddenly shrank, and he saw the arrow in Rong Yu's hand hit Rong Zhan's leg directly. With just one click, Rong Zhan fell to his knees in pain. Boom! The sound of his knees hitting the ground was frightening. Xianyu and Hui's heart skipped a beat. "Stand up!" Rong Zhan shivered in pain. He clenched the hand on the ground hastily, and then forced himself to let go. He almost staggered to stand up, but before he could stand still, another drop fell on his lap, and his body just stood up. He knelt down again with a bang. Thin cold sweat broke out rapidly on his forehead, his face was as pale as paper, and he gritted his teeth to endure the pain. Rong Yu stopped talking and just looked at him expressionlessly. Xianyu and Hui looked at Rong Zhan in fear, feeling that his legs were throbbing in pain. He wanted to say something, but when the sound escaped his throat, he realized that he didn't know what to say. Only then did he realize that no matter how much he heard about it in the past, it was just hearsay, and it was far less scary than facing it in person. "Do you need my help?" A calm and absolutely cold voice rang in his ears, and Rong Zhan's expression changed. He didn't dare to delay any longer, and stood up despite the pain, using his strong willpower to prevent himself from falling down again. "My son, I know my mistake, please punish me." Rong Yu didn't say anything. The arrow in his hand was the most convenient instrument of torture. He landed on Rong Zhan's legs 3 times in succession. No water was released with each blow. Rong Zhan spasmed in pain, his legs were trembling constantly, and sweat dripped from his forehead. Rolling down, his face turned completely white. After 10 strokes, Rong Yu stopped. Rong Zhan's legs trembled violently and his lips turned white, but he tried his best to stand up straight. 10 arrows, Rong Yu ordered, "Continue." Rong Zhan's mind went blank from the pain. It took him a while to hear clearly what his father said, and it took him a very short time to discern the meaning of Rong Yu's words. Then he turned around, walked over slowly, took out 10 arrows and fired them. "Put it into the quiver behind you." Xianyu and Hui is still in a daze. Rong Yu looked over and said in a cold voice, "Didn't you hear that clearly?" Xianyu and Hui suddenly regained consciousness, neatly put 10 arrows into his quiver, and walked back to his original position. When he and Rong Zhan were drawing arrows and setting up their bows, he realized belatedly that the regent only hit Rongzhan and had no intention of punishing him. Why is that? If it was just because his archery skills were not up to par, then he should be punished as well. If it's because... Whoosh! The sound of the arrow from the string brought Xian Yuanhui back from his lost thoughts. When he came back to his senses, he was shocked to find that Rongzhan's arrow actually missed the target. It was not shot down by the regent's arrow, but by himself. The shot missed the direction. For a person who has practiced archery to the point of hitting the target every time, this is a low-level mistake that is almost impossible to make, and it is a fatal mistake. He subconsciously turned his head to look at Rongzhan, but saw that Rongzhan's legs were constantly trembling, his face was extremely pale, and cold sweat was dripping from the corners of his eyes. Even if he tried his best to restrain himself, the extreme pain in his body was not something he could control. Xian Yuanhui frowned and was about to speak. Rongyu had already walked over, his face was noble and cold, and his voice was indifferent. Hand. Rongzhan bit his lip and stretched out his right hand. A fierce beating fell on his hand, and a red mark appeared on the palm of his hand, which soon swelled up. Rongzhan suddenly gritted his teeth and suppressed the painful groan in his throat. Except for the unconscious spasm and curling of the fingertips, his right hand was stretched out steadily, using an unknown amount of self-control. Continue, the calm voice sounded without any emotion. If you don't want these hands anymore, just shoot them off. I want to see how your brother taught you. Rongzhan's heart trembled, his fingers moved convulsively, he gently raised his hand to wipe away the cold sweat rolling down his eyes and cheeks, took another arrow, pulled the bowstring. Even though his right hand was so painful that he could hardly use any strength, he dared not be careless again, aimed steadily at the target, and pulled the bow to the full. Compared to the strictness of his brother in the training ground, his father's abuse-like methods made him almost unbearable. After comparing them today, he realized how gentle his brother was to him in the past. With this thought in mind, Rongzhan hated his stupidity and ignorance even more. He didn't even dare to think about how he would atone for his sins if his brother really got into trouble because of his stupid behavior. There was a mist in front of his eyes. He didn't know if it was the cold sweat condensed on his eyelids or the heat from the bottom of his eyes. He only knew that his vision was blurred for a moment. The cold sweat oozing from his palm soaked the scars, and the pain made him almost unable to hold the arrow. The devilish training had just begun today. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 897. Rongyu stood aside with his hands behind his back. He only threw the arrows in his hands when necessary, which was enough to make the two teenagers defenseless. Many arrows were scattered on the shooting range. None of the arrows fired by the two men could reach the target. In order to save Rongzhan from being beaten, Xian Yuanhui became opportunistic and waited for Rongzhan's arrows. He shot after shooting, two arrows one behind the other. He thought that this way Rongyu would not be able to shoot down their arrows at the same time, and at least one arrow would be able to hit the target. But the facts proved that he still thought too much. For Rongyu, this little trick was not enough to be taken seriously by him. He didn't even need an extra arrow. The arrow he threw was secretly used skillfully, and after shooting down Rongzhan's arrow, it rebounded strangely, then hit Xian Yuanhui's arrow, and three arrows landed one after another. Xian Yuanhui's face changed suddenly, and he couldn't believe what he saw. He even couldn't help but wonder if Rongyu was good at some evil arrow-driving magic. Otherwise, how could he shoot down all their arrows with such terrifying precision? After shooting all 10 arrows, none hit the target. An expected result. Rongyu stood waiting at the edge of the shooting range, while Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui walked over stiffly, their pale faces dripping with sweat, as if they had just been fished out of the water, and their faces were so pale that there was no blood. But this does not make Rongyu soft-hearted. Rongzhan was slapped 10 more times on his legs, like hot oil rolling over him. Even his bones felt like they were about to break. The pain made his legs twitch constantly, as if they were no longer his own. Completely unable to control the violent trembling, cold sweat rolled down his forehead and cheeks, and the sweat on his ears rolled directly down his clothes, being blown by the wind in the biting cold winter, making him feel bitingly cold. Xian Yuanhui was honored to be beaten 10 times because of his opportunism. The pain made him realize more and more clearly that the regent had no intention of joking with them today. This was not even a scene to scare children, but a real punishment. Rongzhan dragged his trembling legs and took 10 more arrows and put them into his quiver. The rule seemed to go without saying much. Although Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui both understood how terrifying the regent was, and also understood that if the regent did not give in today, it would be unreasonable for them to hit the target, but they knew that it was impossible to achieve, but they didn't even say a word. I dare not say more. In the next archery, Xian Yuanhui did not dare to have any thoughts of playing tricks, and obediently fired both arrows with Rongzhan. He did not dare to make mistakes in terms of strength and accuracy. Although the result of whether he could hit the target or not was determined by his attitude, the two of them did not dare to slack off at all. The hand exerts force, the bow is fully drawn, the arms are firmly supported, and the sight is directed at the archery target 100 steps away. At this moment, an arrow carelessly held Rongzhan's arm, and a stern voice reminded, "Don't move." Rongzhan blinked, cold sweat wiping his eyelids and sliding down his eyelids. He stared at the direction of the target for a moment, keeping his arms as steady as possible. "Spread your legs forward and backward." Rong Yu's arrow hit his leg with little force. It was more of a sign than a lesson. "Stabilize the lower body." Rongzhan did as he was told. Rong Yu walked to Xian Yuanhui's side and taught him the same movements once. When both of them maintained the same standard posture, he said lightly, "For half an hour, whoever can't hold on will not have to go back today." Neither of them spoke, nor did they dare to speak at this time. Both the mind and body are in a highly tense state, and both legs are still shaking due to severe pain. It is already a difficult test to just concentrate on controlling the legs, not to mention the time required to fully draw the bow with both hands. The strength is not an action that ordinary people can easily complete. It is almost impossible to persist like this for half an hour. Xian Yuanhui was better, at least he received less beatings, and the pain in his legs was bearable. Rongzhan obviously had a harder time, he could barely manage for a quarter of an hour, but could hardly even think about it for half an hour. Rong Yu turned around and walked aside, with a tall and majestic figure, and just watched silently. A guard walked to the shooting range, picked up the fallen arrows one by one, and put them back into the quiver in the nearby armory. Some of the broken arrows were placed on the other side, and then he walked out and stood with his eyebrows downcast. Outside the school grounds, time passed little by little. Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui were only wearing thin clothes today. If they were simply practicing martial arts, such weather would be nothing to the two teenagers. Practicing martial arts could warm them up, and they would not feel chilly after moving their limbs. Xi's body was covered in injuries, cold sweat flowed across his face, and the cold wind made him shiver. Rongzhan was relying entirely on his will at this time. Both legs were so painful that they were swollen and sore. The sweat under the clothes soaked the broken skin scars, and there was a dense stinging pain, like countless insects and ants were biting. Both arms were equally sore and swollen, and the swelling marks on the hands were too painful to ignore. The palms and fingers holding the bow and arrow were covered with sweat. It didn't take long for the subtle tremors to turn into violent shaking. The archery target 100 steps away began to shake in his sight. Rongzhan gritted his teeth, feeling as if 1,000 kilograms of weight had been pressed on his arms, so heavy that he could hardly support it, but his father was watching, and he really didn't dare to try if he couldn't support it anymore. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 898. Xian Yuan Zhan returned to the East Palace, and his normally gentle face could not help but be dyed with a solemn look. Xian Yuanhao was wearing a thick fur cloak and sitting in front of the case reading. Because he was recuperating in the past 2 days, no memorials were sent to the East Palace. He couldn't stay in bed anymore, so he sat and read and wrote to pass the time. I just had Rongzhan in my mind, so I couldn't keep reading. Your Highness. Xian Yuanzhan walked into the palace and knelt down beside Xian Yuanhao. The regent is supervising the archery practice of my uncle and the second highness on the school grounds. Xian Yuanhao turned his head, stared at his slightly solemn expression, and said calmly, "My father is personally supervising, and the requirements must be extremely strict." Yes, Xian Yuanzhan didn't want him to worry too much, but the fact couldn't be concealed. He only said, "The second highness was taught a hard lesson. My uncle is okay. The regent should know that this behavior belongs to the second highness. That's why I didn't punish my little uncle very much. I was only punished once for being clever while practicing archery." Xian Yuanhao said nothing and took a sip of the hot tea on the table. Xian Yuanzhan was quiet for a moment, then hesitantly said, "Your Highness, would you like to ask Auntie the Queen to come forward and ask for a favor? If the Queen's aunt comes forward to speak, the regent will definitely listen." Xian Yuanhao slowly shook his head. "Do you think your father would hide this from your mother?" Xian Yuanzhan didn't say anything. He wasn't sure whether the regent would hide it from Her Majesty the Queen. But Her Majesty the Queen is a very gentle person, and her second highness is their biological son. If Her Majesty the Queen saw that scene on the school field, it should also feel distressed. Although the Mother Emperor is gentle, she is a principled person and will not interfere in anything. Xian Yuanhao lowered his eyebrows and looked at the book unfolded on the case, but could not read a word. "Father wants to punish Rongzhan. Firstly, it is because of the mistake he made this time, and secondly, it is also to temper his temperament. Although the process is harsh, it can make Rongzhan grow up in the shortest time, and the Queen Mother will not interfere." Xian Yuanzhan frowned. "If I ask my mother to intercede, it will only make my father think that I am ignorant. Even if Rongzhan is spared today, Rongzhan's life will not be easy in the future." Xian Yuanhao said, unable to help but blame himself. "Actually, I am also to blame. In the past, I was too indulgent towards Rongzhan, but if Rongzhan is a little calmer, I won't alarm my father to take action himself." Xian Yuanzhan didn't say anything, just looked at him quietly, and said after a long time, "The second highness is lucky to have an elder brother like the prince." Xian Yuanhao was silent. Isn't it his luck to have Rongzhan as his younger brother? From the day Zhaner was born, he knew that this younger brother would be his responsibility in the future. They were the closest siblings. Watching the child grow up day by day, he felt an indescribable sense of satisfaction in his heart. He taught Zhaner successfully, which is also his biggest wish as an elder brother. He hoped that Zhaner would be happy and healthy throughout his life. But they are not ordinary brothers. He and Rongzhan need to be each other's support and support from now on. It is obviously not enough to rely on brothers and sisters. Being in the royal family, there are unparalleled eyes watching at all times. A weak person, the prince, will not be taken seriously by others, and his voice is not even as good as that of a powerful minister. The emperor needs to be strong, and the general also needs to be stronger than anyone else, strong enough to protect himself, so that he can support each other on the road to supreme imperial power, not let anyone look down upon him, and become each other's strongest back. Xian Yuanhao closed his eyes and remained silent. "I can't let Zhaner become my weakness. My father will not allow it." "Then what should we do?" Xian Yuanzhan frowned slightly. "I looked at the regent's training method, and I'm afraid that Rongchen and I can't stand it. Not to mention that His Highness is younger than us. What if he can't hold it anymore? If it were before, Zhaner might not be able to hold on." Xian Yuanhao closed his eyes and drank tea. "I will definitely be able to hold on this time." Sweating like rain. Rongzhan's legs were shaking non-stop, and his hands holding the bow and arrow were shaking violently and visibly, shaking up and down, sweat dripping on the shooting range. This kind of soreness and fatigue had reached the extreme and could no longer be controlled, and no willpower could stop it. Okay, both Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui are close to exhaustion. However, Rong Yu came over, put the arrow in his hand on the two men's arms, corrected their skewed postures, and said calmly, if anyone can't hold on, he will lose it. He was beaten with his pants down. These words were like a bucket of cold water poured down my head, instantly driving away all the fatigue. Xian Yuanhui and Rongzhan were so tired that they didn't know how much time had passed, but the young man already had a sense of shame. Being beaten was not scary, but taking off his pants and being beaten in public was enough to make them so embarrassed and angry that they died on the spot. Due to the regent's temperament, they didn't even dare to regard the sentence as a threat. Rongzhan didn't know where the strength came from, blinking the sweat from his eyelashes, forcing himself to maintain a straight posture, even with his arms. The tremors were carefully controlled to be as small as possible. He didn't dare to bet on the possibility of his father's words being implemented, because once his father put his words into action, the result would definitely be something he couldn't bear calmly. Facts have proved that human potential can be infinitely stimulated. The two people who had already reached their limit were forced by these words to continue to persevere. Although their postures could not be measured by standards, at least their arm strength and willpower did hold them together. From beginning to end, they did not say anything similar to begging for mercy. Rong Yu barely spoke during the whole process, except for the initial request and a threat in the middle. It was not until half an hour later that he calmly said, "Retract your strength slowly, hold the bow with your left hand, and collect the arrow with your right hand." This sentence was like a drop of sweet dew from heaven, like a sudden amnesty, like a ray of light finally appearing in the endless darkness. Xian Yuanhui's mind relaxed, and his arm suddenly lost all strength. His right hand suddenly lost control, and the arrow in his hand flew out. His hands, which had long been weak, naturally could not complete the action of shooting at the target. The arrow automatically fell down in the air. The sudden mistake made his face change suddenly. Rongzhan was better than him. Although his physical and mental state at this time was not as good as Xian Yuanhui, his fear of his father was much deeper than Xian Yuanhui. After hearing the order, he even spent a very short time to go over his father's words in his mind, and then slowly retracted his strength, loosened the fully drawn bow bit by bit, and put down his hands that were so sore and heavy that they seemed to be filled with lead. Once the force was released, it seemed as if he had no strength to wipe his sweat. Rongzhan stood like a statue for a long time, his whole body seemed empty, and after a long time he slowly turned his head, rubbing his chin on his shoulder with a bit of sluggish movement, wiping off the cold sweat on his face. Both faces were pale and frightening. "How do you feel about your performance?" Rong Yu looked at the two with a cold expression. "Are you invincible in the world? So strong that there is no opponent?" Rongzhan bit his dry lips and slowly knelt on the ground, even his voice was suppressed and no longer lively. "I know my fault, please punish me, father." "Huier knows my fault." Xian Yuanhui followed and knelt down. "Please punish me, regent." Rong Yu looked down at them. "I am very disappointed with your performance." Rongzhan's body shook violently, and his fingertips trembled unconsciously. "Very disappointed. Starting tomorrow, practice archery at the training ground every day at 11 a.m., and I will come to check your training results after I leave the court." Rong Yu said coldly, "You are strong and not afraid of pain, so feel free to be lazy. I will see if I can tear your bones one by one." The training ground was silent, as if even the world had quieted down. "Get up and jog around the training ground 5 times," Rong Yu ordered. "After lunch, go to the Imperial study, and I will talk to you." After saying this, he finally turned around and left. Rongzhan and Xian Yuanhui suddenly lost their strength and knelt quietly and stiffly for a long time. Xian Yuanhui raised his arm and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Are you okay? Rongzhan was not feeling well. He pursed his dry lips and said, your premonition was right. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container, tabula below article thumbnail -300x250, placement, below article thumbnail -300x250, target. Type, mix. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 899. The pain all over his body made Rongzhan realize that his good days were indeed over. Kneeling quietly on the school field, after his body regained some strength, he tried to stand up, and the pain everywhere in his body was instantly awakened. His thighs were swollen, his calves were sore, and the pain in his arms and hands started to scream, it hurts everywhere. Rongzhan gritted his teeth and stood up, the world was spinning, overwhelming pain swept over him, his forehead was wet with cold sweat, and his underwear was completely soaked. He looked at the huge school grounds and staggered a few steps. Their legs were so stiff that it was difficult to walk, but they still had to jog 5 times around the training ground. Are you okay? Xian Yuanhui was a little worried after all. Although he was not in a good condition now, he was still better than Rongzhan. I'll walk 5 laps slowly with you. Rongzhan said, do you think my father can't bear to punish us for laziness anymore? Xian Yuanhui was silent. I can't bear that these 3 words can be applied to anyone, but they can never be applied to the Prince Regent. Today he has thoroughly experienced the Regent's thunderous methods. No wonder he was able to train the most powerful army in the Great Zhou dynasty, and was able to maintain an undefeated position under the cavalry of northern Xinjiang, and to maintain this undefeated myth for so many years. I finally understand why my eldest brother and eldest brother Xie are so afraid of the regent. Xian Yuanhui sighed melancholy. They say that the prince resembles the regent, but compared to the regent, I feel that the prince is as gentle as a bodhisattva. Rongzhan nodded silently. Whoever says that the emperor's brother is the same as his father in the future, he will definitely be the first to disagree. Thinking of brother Huang, Rongzhan couldn't help but feel guilty and self-blame again, and said in a low voice, run quickly, I'm going to see brother Huang after 5 laps. Yes, Xian Yuanhui nodded, you can go and complain to His Highness the Crown Prince, and by the way, stay in the East Palace to have lunch with the Crown Prince. Complain. Rongzhan pursed his lips and looked at him, I think you seem to be in good spirits. Did your father lose his temper when he attacked you? Do you want me to take off my pants and show you the injury on my leg? Xian Yuanhui frowned, the regent is letting you go? Do you think it's possible? Rongzhan was slightly startled when he heard him say to take off his pants. He thought about what his father said just now, do you think that if we didn't persist, would our father really let us take off our pants and be beaten in public? Xian Yuanhui was silent for a moment, you don't really think we persisted for half an hour, do you? Rongzhan frowned, what do you mean? It's not even half an hour. The regent saw that we really couldn't hold on anymore, so he wanted to save face for both of us. Xian Yuanhui said, your father is true to his word, and he must implement the punishment he said, but pain makes people feel that time is long and unbearable, and even a cup of tea can make people mistakenly believe that half a day has passed. The time we lasted must have exceeded a cup of tea, but it was definitely less than half an hour. Rongzhan closed his eyes and remained silent. In this way, the father still let them go. The 2 of them jogged along the school grounds. As Rongzhan ran, he was thinking about how he should admit his mistake and apologize when he saw the emperor later. With more things on his mind, the pain in his leg could be ignored. Running won't be that hard anymore. His father obviously knew their limits better than they did. It was no problem to jog for 5 laps. After 5 laps, another layer of fine sweat appeared under his clothes, and his body and limbs also warmed up, driving them away. Feeling the chill caused by the cold wind. After 5 laps, the sun slowly moved directly above the head, announcing that half the day had passed. The servants beside Rongzhan came over with 2 sedans and said distressedly, "Your Highness, Master Hui, sit down, let's go back in the sedan chair." Rongzhan looked quietly at the 2 sedans parked outside the school grounds and the guards responsible for carrying them, then turned to Xianyuan Hui expressionlessly, "Do you dare to sit?" Xianyuan Hui shook his head, "I dare not." "I don't dare either," Rongzhan said tiredly, "I really wish I didn't have these legs now." Xianyuan Hui was also too tired to move, but looked at the huge palace in the distance. "For the first time, I long for the palace to become smaller, so that my way back can be shortened, so that I don't have to walk so long." Listening to the unrealistic desires of the 2 men, the guard sighed inwardly that it was not easy for the royal heirs. It seems that ever since the regent, a cold-faced and ruthless person, came to power in the Dongling kingdom, it was not only the ministers in the court who were frightened all day long, but also the prince's life was not easy. However, there is a fact that cannot be ignored. The atmosphere in the court has improved a lot. Corrupt officials are no longer so blatant. The local bullies no longer dare to act tyrannically. The army has become stronger every day in 10 years. Other countries not only dare not provoke again, but instead pay tribute every year. The territory of Dongling it is twice as big as before, and the people's lives are more stable and prosperous than before. In general, the lives of the royal family and dignitaries are not as good as before, but the common people are many times better off than before. The guard couldn't help but wonder. This time Her Majesty the Queen and the regent seem to be different from the usual emperors. The regent is a yandere who needs to be pampered. Author, Nan Huang. Chapter 900. No matter how far the road is, or how heavy the legs are, the road that should be walked must be walked. When Rongzhan and Xianyuan Hui returned to the East Palace, the palace servants were all shocked to see how miserable the 2 looked. They hurriedly came forward to serve them, serving tea and water. Rongzhan was sweating all over, but he had no desire to take a shower. He wanted to lie down and fall asleep, but the facts did not allow it. He forced himself to take a shower. After taking off his clothes, he looked down at the horrible purple and swollen marks on his legs. For the first time, he suspected that he was not his father's biological son, but this thought only flashed through his mind for a moment, and he quickly shook his head and threw it away. Doubting his own life experience is to doubt the feelings of the Queen Mother for his father, which is an unforgivable sin. If his father knew this idea, he would not just beat him up, but might directly abolish him. Rongzhan sighed, lowered his head and looked at his palm pitifully. There was also a swollen mark on his hand, because the skin was rubbed and painful because of the constant bow shooting. It was difficult to take a bath by himself, but he really didn't want people to see him in such a miserable state. Rongzhan tore off a piece of clean cloth to wrap around his hands, then stepped into the bathtub and soaked his body in warm water. "I want to sleep." Rongzhan leaned against the bathtub and finally relaxed his body for a while. He closed his eyes and thought that he had fallen into the hands of his father. The days of hardship were just beginning. He couldn't think about it. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that the future was bleak. He couldn't take a bath for too long. After all, he had injuries on his body, and some of the wounds were bleeding. Rongzhan took a short rest during the bath, washed off the sweat on his body, and got up, wiped himself and put on his clothes. Although it was a bit hard to bear, he was a martial artist after all. Even if he was exhausted to the extreme, it didn't mean that he had no strength at all. He forced himself to take care of himself, turned around and walked out, and walked towards his brother's bedroom. "How is my brother today?" This time Rongchen didn't stop him again. He stared at his pale face and frowned. Is the second prince okay? Yeah, it's okay. Rongzhan didn't want to show weakness in front of others. Although the fatigue in his voice couldn't be concealed, his tone sounded very relaxed. I want to see my brother. Rongchen stepped aside. Rongzhan entered the hall without any hindrance, and Rongchen followed him in. Xian Yuanhao had just taken the medicine and was half lying on the brocade couch by the window reading a book and basking in the sun. Xian Yuanzhan covered him with a blanket. The whole person looked weak and quiet. Rongzhan stared at his brother's pale face, his eyes suddenly turned red. He walked over and whispered, "Brother." Xian Yuanhao turned his head and looked at him. "What?" Rongzhan bit his lip. His eyes fell on Xian Yuanhao's pale face that could not hide his illness. Remorse and self-blame surged, and he knelt down. "I was wrong, I shouldn't have deceived my brother. Brother, hit me, I deserve to die. Okay, get up," Xian Yuanhao said softly, "I don't blame you." Rongzhan couldn't stop crying. Since he knew the news of his brother's accident until now, his tense emotions finally collapsed, and he couldn't help sobbing, "Brother." Xian Yuanhao put down the book and pulled him up. "How did you perform on the training ground today?" Rongzhan's eyes were still red, and his expression froze when he heard this. Xian Yuanhao raised his eyebrows. "Not good." Rongzhan hung his head, like a frustrated little animal. "Father said he was very disappointed with my and my uncle's performance." Disappointment is already unbearable, and he has to add the word very before disappointment, which shows that he is probably useless in his father's heart. Xian Yuanhao was silent for a moment, and said lightly, "Father's requirements are quite high." Rongzhan couldn't think about it anymore. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that he had no desire to live. He raised his eyes fell on Xian Yuanhao's face, pursed his lips and said, "How is my brother? Is he seriously injured?" "I'm sorry, it's my bastard dash." "It's over, don't blame yourself anymore," Xian Yuanhao said lightly, "you will bear the consequences of your own actions. I can't tell my father to continue to control you now. You will have to be trained by my father for a long time in the future. This can also be regarded as a punishment." Rongzhan felt extremely heavy. He wanted to say that his father was too scary. He didn't want to be disciplined by his father at all. It was better for him to follow his brother. However, looking at his brother's pale and weak face, he felt guilty and had to swallow the bitter fruit of his own sin silently. Xian Yuanhao coughed lightly, and a trace of blood overflowed from the corner of his mouth. "Brother," Rongzhan was shocked, "someone come." Xian Yuanhao frowned, "Don't shout, I'm fine." Rongzhan looked at him in panic, his eyes full of anxiety. "Brother." "Your Highness is fine." Xian Yuanzhan brought water over and handed it to Xian Yuanhao to rinse his mouth. "Since Rongzhan is here, prepare lunch." Rongzhan hasn't eaten with His Highness for a long time. Rongzhan looked at Xian Yuanhao absent-mindedly. It would be wrong to say that there was no problem at all. The heart meridian was damaged by the extreme pain. Although Chu Nanyi treated and regulated it carefully, it was unlikely to be completely eradicated. This also led to the fact that over the years, even though Xian Yuanhao's martial arts were inherited from his father, and even though he was able to rule the world and make plans at a young age, the root of his physical illness could never be cured. Every winter, he would cough, and his pale face was a guilt that Xian Yuan Rongzhan would never be able to eliminate in his life. Yes, Xian Yuanhao nodded. "Prepare more of Rongzhan and Hui's favorite foods." Xian Yuanzhan nodded. Rongzhan couldn't help but get red in the eyes again. "That's enough." Xian Yuanhao stood up. "You're so old, why are you still crying?" Rongzhan said stubbornly, "I didn't cry." Xian Yuanhao hummed, "I didn't cry, but my eyes couldn't help but get red, like a red-eyed rabbit." Rongzhan couldn't refute, so he simply stopped talking. Rongchen reported, "Your Highness, Master Hui is here." Xian Yuanhao looked up and saw that Xian Yuanhui's face was not much better than Rongzhan's. Both of them looked exhausted, and couldn't help laughing. You two are now truly in trouble. Xian Yuanhui corrected, uncle and nephew. Xian Yuanhao was silent, thinking of the name Rongzhan had just changed invisibly. It seemed that Xian Yuanhui was not implicated in vain this time, at least in exchange for Rongzhan's willing little uncle. So he nodded. This time it was Rongzhan who implicated you, let him compensate you in the future. Your Highness, you are too kind. Xian Yuanhui looked like he was sharing the hardship. Rongzhan is ignorant, so naturally as his uncle I have to bear more responsibility, and besides, the morning drill was not targeted at anyone, the regent punished us because we did not perform well. He paused, and couldn't help but look embarrassed. I guess the real punishment will be in the afternoon. Afternoon, Xian Yuanhao frowned. The regent ordered Rongzhan and I to go to the imperial study after lunch. Xian Yuanhui raised his hand and scratched his head. I heard that it was a place that my elder brother and elder brother Xie were afraid of. It should be very scary. Xian Yuanhao turned his head and looked at Rongzhan. Rongzhan nodded. Father said he wanted to have a good talk with us. Xian Yuanhao was silent. It's okay, Rongzhan said, don't worry, my brother. I will behave well and won't make my father angry. If he makes his father angry, he will definitely be the one who suffers. He is not that stupid. Xian Yuanhao looked at him. You have caused too much trouble this time. You have caused your uncle to suffer with you. You'd better remember this lesson. A blessing in disguise. Xian Yuanhui was open-minded. It is my honor to get the guidance of the regent. Most people don't have this opportunity to be taught by the regent personally. Although this process is not very pleasant and the hard work is unbearable, only those who endure the hardships can become superior people. In the future, he will inherit his father's legacy and return to Shengjing to be the next king of Genese. If he can get the personal guidance of the regent for a period of time, he will definitely benefit from it for the rest of his life. Rongzhan had a strange expression, so, this time it's all thanks to me. If thinking this way makes you feel better, Xian Yuanhui smiled, anyway, I don't want you to feel guilty about this. Be more respectful to me when you see me in the future, and calling me uncle more often is the greatest reward for me.